Session is to explore some of the considerations for children and young people who live with a life-limiting illness. Dr. Susan Madge is going to be talking about how they've worked with the subject at the Royal Brompton Hospice. Lucy here will be sharing her thoughts on sex and sexuality and experiences of young adults with life-threatening, life-limiting conditions. And Sacha Langton-Gilkes is going to reflect upon advanced care planning and working with her son, Dee Dee. So without further ado, just to sort of quickly set the scene, I think it's important to recognise that children are not just little adults. They have grown with very different concepts and conditions. And a lot of the conditions that children and young adults will have were not previously known to adult services. So it's something very new, and the way that they're coming through the system is very new. And I think it's also important to recognise that for these families, they've gone from a scenario where they are one of a few getting a lot of services to suddenly becoming one of many, and actually possibly not a priority for adult services, because in a lot of respects they're not recognised as being palliative at the point they transition. And that's a really important thing to think about when we're working with families who are used to the concept that their child is on a lifelong journey of palliative care, suddenly to be told, well, you're not going to die in the next 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, so we're not recognising you as meeting our criteria. And for a lot of our families, that has been quite a challenge. Unlike adults who will develop neurodegenerative conditions or dementia-type conditions, children may not have an experience or a memory of life when it was different, because it's such a lifelong progressive condition that they don't actually remember a time when their life was relatively normal, whatever that might mean. A lot of children will have learning disabilities, and some of those will be progressive. Some will have such severe learning disabilities that they are actually causing physical disabilities, and it's their brain involvement that is actually causing a lot of the symptoms and the problems and difficulties that they have. As I touched on earlier, it's important to remember that the definition of children's palliative care and adult palliative care is very different. And those who are sort of looking at research, I think that's something we probably need to start looking at much more intently than we have done previously, particularly if we're going to continue to support these young people. Often they do fall through the net at the point of transition, and that's something that we need to work together around picking up what the issues might be, how we might support them. And just finally, I think the research that we've been looking at to date suggests that because of their poor prognosis and previous poor life expectancy, a lot of the children reaching adult years have had very poor education, but also they've not had access to the sort of support around making choices for the future, such as life, education, profession, career development, and certainly in the case of the work that we've been doing with the Open University, sex, sexuality, relationships. Just to put a shameless plug for Maddie Blackburn, who was supposed to be chairing the session today, but unfortunately is unwell. There are 2 poster presentations on stalls 76 and 77, which look at exploring sensitive issues with young people with life-threatening, life-limiting conditions, and also one on the issues around sex, sexuality and relationships. So if you have the opportunity, please do go ahead and look at those. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Susan Madge, who is Consultant Nurse, Associate Director of the Adult CF Centre at the Royal Brompton Hospital in London. Susan undertook nurse training followed by specialist paediatric training at Great Ormond Street Hospital, where she began working with children with cystic fibrosis. Following a master's degree in psychology, Susan completed her doctoral thesis in behavioural sciences at the Institute of Child Health. Susan has been working with children and adults with CF for over 30 years, and her areas of interest and research include adolescence, burden of care, fertility and pregnancy, and end-of-life issues. She is involved nationally and internationally with standards of care for CF, is a past board member of the European Cystic Fibrosis Society, and review for a number of journals. She also runs an international multidisciplinary course on CF and has created a web-based version of the course. Over to Susan, thank you.
Hello, I'm a bit of an interloper into your conference because I don't work in a hospice, but I do work with all the people I work with, all the people with cystic fibrosis will die because they have a life-limiting illness. This is one word I've missed off here is predicted. So we can predict from our national registry data that children born today will live, 50% of them will live to 47 years of age. So that's children born today. It's a very complicated disease, there is no cure, and I guess from diagnosis at birth, life is one long palliation. Just to give you an overview, I'm not going to teach you about CF, it's a disease that affects all parts of the body. So lots of lung disease, and that's mainly the reason why people with CF die. Lots of GI problems, and the longer we are able to keep people alive, the more complications start emerging. So we know now that there is a 6-fold increase in gastrointestinal cancers as they get older because of the genetic mutation. They get insulin-dependent diabetes, they get a lot of endocrine problems, men are infertile. Obviously, there's a higher risk of anxiety and depression if you're growing up and living with this, and a lot of ENT problems. So as you can see, it's a disease that affects all parts of the body, and we spend, and they spend, all of our time and our relationship over this lifelong journey trying to keep people as well as possible for as long as possible. However, I can say the word 47, and yes, that's in the future, but our median age of death at the moment is around 30 years of age. When I first started working in CF, it was a disease always described as a disease of childhood, and somehow that still lives on in people's minds that children die of CF, but it's very rare in the UK, not in the rest of the world, in some of the Eastern European countries, for example. But in the UK, childhood death from cystic fibrosis is rare. There are under 19s, probably about 8 or 9 deaths a year. I've got a few figures just again to place it. So in 2017, from the registry, there were 8 deaths of 19 years and under, with a total population in the UK of 10,500 children and adults with CF. And over 20, there were 140 deaths. So what we're finding is that in pediatrics, the pediatricians are brilliant at looking after them, and they stay well and transition into adult care, and they're living longer and longer. So we are, which is exciting and also terrible, is there are more and more adults with cystic fibrosis and no resources for them, because resources were set when it was a disease of childhood. It's an unpredictable disease. We don't know when people are going to die. And so we carry out this active and palliation all at the same time. Less so when they're very well, but as they come towards the end of their lives, we still pursue an active and palliative form of treatment, which can become confusing. So where are we today? It is a life-limiting disease. Few childhood deaths, which make us and made us start to describe cystic fibrosis as a chronic disease of childhood. It may be us getting a bit excited about this, but I think we can more or less think about it like that. A lot of adults today, their parents were told they were not expected to live much beyond their teens, and now they are alive and proving a point. And they always describe their lives as living with cystic fibrosis, not dying of cystic fibrosis. And for every family, even though the diagnosis was given at birth, there's still a huge shock when they die. Often the longer they survive, the more shocking it is, because they keep beating it, and then they succumb to it. But there are always stories in the press. So this was from 2011 in The Guardian, and this young man here wrote about the fact that he was got to 40, and he was expected to die when he was young, so he was celebrating the fact that he'd got to 40. And the little infographic at the bottom was from the CF Foundation, which is the national charity in America, and they published this in 2013 to show that they had 29% of the population was over 18 in 1986, and then in 2013 it had gone up to nearly 50%. And I just had a look at the figures from the last lot of their registry data. It had gone up to 53.5%. So it's a slow creep, but we all know they will die young. So why do we talk about dying? We should be talking about living and encouraging everyone to live as full life as possible, even if it's a short life. And we do. But recently, in the last few years, because we've got so excited about the survival end of the scale, we've sort of forgotten about the end of life side of it. And there was an editorial in the Journal of Cystic Fibrosis where there was a number of pieces of research about the clinicians, not the people with CF, and clinicians saying that they feel now that they're lacking training in basic palliative care skills, particularly in paediatrics, as children are rarely dying, that the CF team, the multidisciplinary team, and we work in big multidisciplinary teams always, now feel inadequately prepared. They're slowly being de-skilled over time. And so there was a request for more education. The other thing that was noted was that we are leaving advanced care planning until it's too late, when the disease process and the people are too ill to participate. So where I work, I work in the biggest adult CF centre in Europe, and so we thought we've got a big population, a big team, we need to think about this and do something about it. So we looked at advanced care planning first. We have probably 20 odd deaths per year. And so we got our multidisciplinary team together, and we just had a sort of free-for-all talking about what we need to know. And there were several areas of concern just within our team. There was a lack of education about end of life, that we had no formally recognised advanced care planning, and that we felt we were poorly supported. We do have a palliative care team that's supported by the Royal Marsden Hospital, which is just next door to us. But we also felt that we hadn't really engaged enough with them, and that we were confused over whose roles different things were. We acknowledged that we discussed advanced care planning, but it was never formal, and we never documented anything. And it was usually centred around medical management, including the DNAR orders, or discussing ceilings of treatment, or whenever we discussed lung transplant. So a couple of us decided to take this a bit further and look at advanced care planning, and just coincidentally, the Cystic Fibrosis Trust, which is the only national CF charity in the UK, contacted me and said, we're thinking of looking at advanced care planning. So we sort of buddied up and tried to do this together. So from the Brompton, we looked at the literature, looked at web-based documents, we stole everything that was out there and available to seal, and then we put together a draft document, because what we were being told, locally, nationally and internationally, that there was nothing cystic fibrosis specific. So we did it, and we sent it round our multidisciplinary team. We also gave it to the palliative care team, and then we gave it to the Royal Marsden Hospital and asked them and the education, the research and the clinical lot there to look at it. And we got loads of comments back, and we revised it. And then we gave it to our patients, because they co-design and work with us with everything. We don't work in isolation. We gave it to families, and we gave it to some of the bereaved relatives, because we wanted everyone's point of view of this, because if it was going to work, everyone had to have a say. We got lots, as you can imagine, comments back, and we revised it again. Then we sent it out to 7 of the largest CF centres in the UK, all who had over 400 patients. And then in the UK, there are special interest groups for different members of the multidisciplinary team. So we sent it to the physiotherapist special interest group, the psychosocial interest group, and the clinical nurse specialist interest group, and got all their comments back. And at the end of that, we thought, right, everyone we can possibly think of has had a say. We need to get going and start using it. So we started giving it to the patients coming on the ward, and we also asked them for some feedback. Now, I'll just discuss the content, because it can be quite controversial. Obviously, the things that will be in all advanced care planning, next of kin and important people, but patients told us they also want to put down names of people we mustn't discuss things with. So we do have a box of don't talk to these people. Obviously, things for loved ones, memory boxes and things. And things that are specific to us is supporting children, because if you have CF, men are infertile, but they can father children through assisted conception. you may think that why are they having children, but it's part of being normal, it's part of having a life, despite knowing that you have a short life. And when the young people with CF want to talk about babies, we do talk about babies. We don't say, don't be mad, you can't have a baby. But we talk to them about, have you thought about what's going to happen to your baby when you die? How are you going to help your child through your deteriorating health and your death? Who's going to look after your baby or your young child after you've died? And they're quite long and can take some time, those sorts of conversations. But they still, we still support them in having the children, but when we get to the advanced care planning stage, we also need to talk to them about how to involve their children in this, and what sort of conversations they should have, and how much involvement they want their families and their children to be. Obviously, psychological support, everyone has that, but we have to talk about lung transplant, because that's one of the thing quite rare, because there aren't enough organs in this country. But we do talk about lung transplant. Not everyone is guaranteed one, and it's not successful in everyone, but that is also part of advanced care planning, is yes, you can be on the transplant list, but you can die on the list, or you could die after surgery. We talk about ceilings of care, so when people are towards the end of their life, we talk about resuscitation. What we would do, no, we wouldn't fully resuscitate them. We wouldn't intubate them and ventilate them, but we might offer some supportive care. If they're on the waiting list for transplant and we think they're a good risk and we've talked to them about, we might put them on ECMO while they wait for transplant. But again, that's a huge decision. We try and do a lot of awake ECMO so that they can be part of the conversation, but it's still this balance between palliative and very, very active care, which some people find a bit odd when talking about palliative care. All the other things around religion, spiritual beliefs, preferred place of death is a tricky one, because we know that most people with CF die in hospital, and we think probably it's because they spend their lives with us. We have lifelong relationships with them. National guidelines mean that we see them every 2 months in outpatients, and as they get sicker, they're in hospital for longer and longer and longer. So the CF ward is a place of safety and security and familiarity. They know all the staff on the ward, their families know the ward, their kids know the ward. So it isn't such an odd thing that they feel very comfortable being on the ward to die. Obviously concerns around the usual end-of-life things, but then right down at the end of the list is organ donation. Because some of them are on the list for lung transplant, we do talk to all of them about organ donation. They can't obviously donate quite a few organs in their bodies, but they can donate their corneas, they can donate their heart valves, and they often want to give something back. So it's very important that we give them the opportunity to do that. We had a young lad who was 20 who died last year, and he was a medical student, and he wanted to donate his body to a medical school. And we had to be careful that it didn't go to his medical school, because that would have freaked out his student colleagues. And we got it donated to a medical school a long, long, long way away, in the hope but that's what he wanted. And at the time, his mother was just distraught by this. But after he died and it happened, she rang us up and came to visit, said it was the best thing ever, and she was glad that she managed to get through that period, because now she's very proud of it, and she's really pleased that the whole process happened. So we introduced it a couple of years ago. We did all sorts of things that we could identify on our electronic patient records, because it gets uploaded. The patients are given a copy, and we ask them to share it with everybody, so everybody in their family and their friends know what's going on. And whenever they're admitted, we talk about looking at again, do you want to make any changes? And because we're working with the CF Trust, it's available nationally, and we've made a little guide for people who aren't used to filling it in, to show them how to fill it in. So we introduced it to all people who had a lung function of less than 40%, who were listed for transplant or referred or had end-stage complications. And they completed it with a member of the multidisciplinary team who they felt most comfortable with. So 23 people were offered it, with a median age of 35, and pretty poor lung function, 25%. 8 were listed for transplant, 8 were being referred, and 7 either didn't want one or weren't suitable. And 20 documented in ACP3 didn't want to have anything to do with it, although they eventually did, because we just keep going on at them. And 19 filled in the survey. So most of them were pleased that we had come to them with this. most of them thought it was about the right time, although two said we should have done it much, much earlier. They thought it was really important it was done with someone that they were very familiar and knew very well. And they identified that the physio and the nurse specialists are the people they know best, and they were the people they preferred to fill them in with. They rate comments for us and very helpful, and we have done some revisions since then, so I'll just read them out to you. I found it enlightening and comprehensive. I think it's important that it's a member of the team that you can trust and easily talk to. I think the form should be introduced to all people with CF, no matter how well or ill, as it would have your wishes in place if you were to suddenly become unwell. The way it's set out is not so morbid. It's direct but not so harsh you can't answer. It should always be done by someone who the patient is comfortable talking to, and I think it's a very good idea, and so do my family. Daunting but necessary. I found it helpful as it made me think about things that I wouldn't have otherwise thought about writing down. The form is a really good idea, and I think it covered everything. So we've got it in place, we use it. Fortunately, we had some resistance for some members of our team. Now all of our team are on it. We're doing it earlier and earlier, and I've just come back recently from America where their new transplant guidelines have been published, and they have set the lung function level that you should start discussing lung transplant as 50%. And there was some discussion about it, but it was apparently all the people with CF that were on this working party said, you have to start these conversations early. If we want a lung transplant and there's something wrong with us, we need lots of time to sort that out, whether we're underweight or we've got bacteria that aren't suitable for transplant, we need to get rid of them. So I think we are being told when to start these conversations, when to start planning, and we as the clinicians are bad at it, and we are now being taught to get in there really, really early. So the other part of this was educating the team. There isn't much education around, and it's not CF specific. So just quickly, we designed a CF specific course and put it online. So it offers flexibility. People can do it when they want to. It's easy, acceptable, and it's free. So all members of the CF team, or anybody in the world can access it, actually. We've got 10 multi-professional speakers from the CF world, from the palliative care world, to speak on it, plus a partner who gave one of the talks and was filmed about what it's like being with your wife who's waiting for a transplant and who dies before she can get one. And then it's divided into modules: the disease trajectory, end-of-life care, introduction to supportive and palliative care, non-invasive ventilation, lots of our patients are on that, transplantation, symptom control, advanced care planning. And then we had the patients also took part, but they didn't want to be filmed, so we recorded their stories and then worked with an animator, and there are little animations all the way through of the patient's story. So you can't really see this. This is a bit what it looks like. You work through it. We have the speaker, and then the slides come up beside them. They get a certificate at the end, but we are about to launch it, but some people have done it for us just to test it out, and it's very, very popular. What we're planning to collect is some anonymized data on their profession and what country they work on, and some self-assessment confidence score. Having done the course, do you now feel more confident in your end-of-life care? And that's our project. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. We've decided for this session that we'll take questions at the end of everybody's session. So if you have thoughts in your head, just hold on to that thought. I'm now going to go on to introduce Lucy Watts. Lucy's a 24-year-old young person who has a progressive, life-threatening condition. She's benefited from palliative care for over 7 years. She's a passionate advocate. I've worked with Lucy for quite a number of years, and she's amazing. A passionate advocate and patient lead, working both within the UK and globally. She works on various topics, including palliative care for people of all ages, personalised care, patient involvement, disability and sexuality. She holds numerous roles within organisations. She co-leads research, undertakes paid consultancy and speaking, as well as setting up the International Palliative Care Patient and Carer Network, Palliative Voices. She's currently setting up a charity for young adults with complex health needs, and it's about young adults advocating for themselves and promoting their own wishes and needs. Lucy received her MBE in 2016 for services to young people with disabilities. Lucy.
So thank you, everyone. Obviously, I'm Lucy. Now Alison has introduced me. I have a life-limiting illness that's caused complex medical needs and disability. And I found out 2 weeks ago that it's actually a rare form of mitochondrial disease after years of undiagnosis, misdiagnosis. So it's quite an achievement to get to that point. But it means I have multiple organ failure. I'm dependent on TPN, which is intravenous nutrition. I have various medications, interventions, bags and tubes to function for the organs that can't do it for themselves. And it means I require round-the-clock care, most of this provided by an intensive care nurse. And also my mum is trained in all the techniques necessary to keep me alive. And I also have my assistant's dog, Molly, who's a big part of my life and helps me greatly through her tasks and her medical alert. I've benefited from palliative care since I was 17, and at a point when my medical team had finally had that difficult conversation and explained to us that my condition was going to shorten my lifespan, a conversation which I think they'd been skirting around having for quite a long time. I became supported by the J's Hospice, which is a young adult hospice at home service locally to me. And their support has been invaluable, and it's actually saved my life as well as improved it and changed it. I'm also supported by a palliative care consultant who works locally across the local hospital as well as the local adult hospice, and her support has been fantastic as well. A year after finding out my condition was life-limiting, at the age of 18, I was told my prognosis was less than 5 years, and I'm now 25. I shouldn't have made 23, and I've got a lot of living yet to do. Palliative and hospice care has transformed my life. They've managed my symptoms, they've given me the best quality of life possible, and are also the reason I'm sitting before you today. It was my palliative care nurse, when doing my end-of-life plan, who said to me, "So what do you want to do now? What matters to you?" And no one had ever asked that question before, and I responded, "I want to make a difference." My hospice nurse didn't forget this, and after doing some filming with the hospice, my nurse Bev put me forward for an opportunity with Together for Short Lives to speak at their reception in the House of Commons, and I haven't looked back since. I have an incredible life thanks to hospice and palliative care, and as Alison said, I've now got an MBE, an honorary master's, and I was recently named as one of the 100 most influential disabled people in Britain. Quite an achievement. But I also believe strongly that palliative care is the reason I've exceeded my prognosis through the life they've given me as a result. And I very much feel they've kept me going mentally and given me a life that enables me to live well, and I think that keeps me going a lot. I was born with health problems, but did not become seriously ill until I was 14. And soon after that, I was housebound and then bedbound, and I was isolated from my peers. I did my education at home with help from home tutors, and I was regularly in hospital in London and prevented from enjoying the newfound freedoms, independence and life experiences of my peers as they were gaining more independence and living life to the full. One aspect of that life that I was isolated from was sex, sexuality and relationships. Unlike the frank conversations that my mother had with my older sister, we'd never had such conversations, but that was because our priority was keeping me alive. Everything else seemed to pale into insignificance, and it was so off the radar. It wasn't even I didn't even consider myself a sexual being or in need of that, because it was just, I need to stay alive, I need to stay alive, and it just became so far removed from me, and that was quite hard. And it wasn't actually until I met a researcher who was researching sex, sexuality and relationships for young people with life-limiting conditions that this aspect of my life was brought to the fore. And I actually started to see myself in that way and to consider myself and what my own wishes and thoughts are. And what I find hard is that why was it a researcher who was the first person in my life who had ever asked me or viewed me as a sexual being or acknowledged that part of my life, let alone helped me to explore it? Why had it never come up with any other professional? I had seen hundreds of professionals, nurses, doctors, therapists. No one had ever asked me, recognised it, said anything. And it just, as I said, I didn't even acknowledge it within myself. And this had a knock-on effect in that I saw myself as asexual, unable of having a relationship, being unattractive, but also unworthy. And when you have a disability, feelings of worth come into it a lot. And when you think about yourself as unworthy, that's really damaging. And some people see disabled people as asexual, and as such that any form of sex and relationships or conversations about this is unnecessary. Some of us are incapable of meaningful relationships, let alone sex intimacy, and goodness forbid, wanting a family. Some especially have prejudiced attitudes towards young people or who are LGBTQ. And I have friends one of my friends who was asked why she was making her life more difficult to choose to be LGBTQ as well as disabled, as if that was a choice. Sexuality is not a choice, nor is disability. And why is sexuality and disability such an issue? Why are life-limited young adults facing barriers in exploring what is a normal part of life? You know, sex is normal, sexuality is normal, relationships are normal. Why aren't we looking into it? It's vital that we realise young people like me with life-limiting conditions do not grow up asexual or indifferent, that we too have wants, needs and desires like any other young person. If you think our peers want it and need it and do it, that's what we should be doing. We must not be infantilised, which happens a lot in the care sector. We must be treated as emerging and maturing adults. And whilst we must ensure we keep young adults safe, and I do not doubt that, we must do so without preventing our right to explore that aspect of our lives. For us, sexuality is a normal part of growing up. Having a disability or life-limiting condition doesn't change that. We just face additional hurdles and barriers in exploring that part of our lives and need support to do so. Professionals, and indeed our parents and carers, must set aside their own perspectives and have these so-called difficult conversations with their young people and help them with their right to explore their sexuality. We must stop sex, sexuality and relationships for people with disabilities and life-limiting illnesses being a taboo. We as a society are sending the wrong messages to young people like me, and that has a damaging effect on our lives and on our emotional well-being. Another aspect that is difficult for young adults is the inability to experiment, to take acceptable risks, to have casual relationships, to explore their emerging sexuality, to be able to make their own decisions and be supported in those choices, even if those around them might not agree with them. And while safeguarding is important, and we should do that, and we must make sure young people are kept safe, we can't limit a young person's right to explore this part of their life, to explore their sexuality, to make their own decisions, and even make mistakes, because that's how we learn. We learn by making mistakes, and we learn by experimenting. All young people get to experiment through their teenage years. They do things that they probably shouldn't. They make their parents cringe. You know, that's part of growing up, and that's part of how we learn who we are. We also often lack the social opportunities that our peers enjoy, which is a really big problem. This can be due to inaccessible venues, a lack of care hours, or restrictions of our actual care packages themselves. For some of us, our care providers, parents, carers and professionals may prevent us from attending certain social situations or be unhappy to support us in that social situation. We face so many barriers and restrictions in our lives. And if you can't meet other people, how can you form relationships? How can we ever explore our sexuality in intimate lives? Not only for that, but for people like me who need 24/7 care, it's quite off-putting trying to chat someone up when you've got a nurse, a carer, or your parents sitting in the room next to you, managing all your needs. It's not nice. But it's really hard because that's our life. We have to have those carers with us. We can't have a choice in that. One important thing about sexuality is that we must accept that sexuality is not just about actual intercourse, which people seem to confuse it with. Whilst that's part of it, there's actually so much more than to sexuality and relationships than just sex. It's about being loved, being seen as attractive. It's about positive body image. It's about exploring and forming your gender and sexual identity. It's about finding your place in the world, being comfortable with who you are. It's about friendships as much as relationships. It's about being intimate, from hand-holding, kissing and cuddling, yes, to sex itself. It's about emotional well-being and about feeling a part of the world around you. So often we are isolated from the world, and when you don't feel connected with the world, that can be really difficult. We may need support with some or all of our lives, and this can make it hard, not just in terms of sex itself, but in exploring relationships generally and our lives as a whole. Young people still may want to become parents, and around there, this is also a lot of work, overcoming a lot of prejudiced attitudes towards these young people becoming parents, such as supporting them with the process from genetic counselling to family planning, from pregnancy to stopping medications and making plans for that, and the support to actually be a parent with your life-limiting condition. So a friend of mine is trying for a baby and has a life-limiting condition and has suffered multiple miscarriages in her stillbirth. And she's been told that maybe this is the world's way of telling her she shouldn't be having children and she should give up on that dream. But why shouldn't she be supported to be a mum? That's all she wants to do in life. That is her great big goal for life. And yet she's been prevented by attitudes rather than actual support. She's got the medical support, but yet the attitudes of those around her are what she's fighting. As I mentioned briefly, we must also appreciate that exploring sex, sexuality and relationships is actually integral to emotional well-being. It's a part of life, it's a part of growing up, it's a part of our experience of ourselves and the world around us, and it's a universal want, need and desire. The link between the two, between sexuality and emotional well-being, is really underestimated. I don't think people recognise it in the same way as it should be. And we must make sure that young people like me are able to explore sexuality and relationships as a normal part of our lives and growing up. And those around us know how to support us in that aspect of our lives. We must stop infantilising disabled people and preventing them from exploring sex, sexuality and relationships, and all the things linked to this. We must stamp out prejudices, ensure that unnecessary barriers are not created, and ensure our rights are upheld. We must also recognise that individuals with learning disabilities have sexual needs and desires. A learning disability doesn't remove that, doesn't remove those innate needs, desires and feelings and the maturing body in a sexual context. And although I don't have time to develop on this today, we must recognise that everyone is a sexual being, even if they need support to achieve that. In order to achieve this, services, hospices and teams should have a sexuality policy to know where staff stand in terms of supporting young people with their needs and sexuality in their relationships. And this may include appointing sexuality champions, which was something that Alison developed at Rainbow's Hospice. And having the champions within the organisation means that all staff and patients have someone to go to who can help with this aspect of their life and know where they stand. And before I end my speech, I wanted to share through my work with the Open University Sexuality Alliance, of which Alison's a part. In 2016, we produced the Sexuality Guidance and Standards, which supports professionals and organisations to know how to support young people with life-limiting conditions to explore sex, sexuality and relationships, but also where they stand within the law, and as case studies and stories that can help you understand this. And if you would like a copy, come and find me, and I can either give you a copy or you can grab my email and I'll email you a copy. But also the Open University Sexuality Alliance generally works to improve the lives of young people with life-limiting conditions to explore sexuality, sex and relationships by supporting professionals, parents, carers, and also young people ourselves. So the Alliance was formed in 2014, and our first project was producing the guidance. We've now moved on to our second phase of work, which is being done in conjunction with Hospice UK. So we've just been awarded £40,000 by Together for Short Lives to develop some open educational resources. So these are mixed media resources that are they're not actually giving information, but they're more about starting those conversations. So professionals starting it with young people starting it with professionals, with parents, with carers, giving them the tools to be able to have those conversations and feel okay with having them. And we're really looking forward to getting started on that project. So I hope my speech has opened your eyes and helped you think about things in a different way, and that maybe you can take some things away in your clinical practice and be more understanding, but also more empowered to understand this issue and to support your patients with it, because this applies to everyone, not just young people, all adults with life-limiting conditions. And all adults generally. Everyone in this room has got a gender and sexual identity. That's part of who you are, and we are no different. Hospice palliative care services need to recognise and include sex, sexuality and relationships in part of the care given to all patients and their families. And young people who have life-limiting conditions are still young people. We must make sure we have access to the same life experiences, choices, opportunities, the ability to explore this aspect of our lives, to have relationships of all kinds, and also the fulfilment of our basic human rights. Sex, sexuality and relationships are a normal part of life. We must ensure young people have their rights upheld and can access, explore and fulfil this part of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And also to say there are just, I think, 2 or 3 copies left, but there are some copies of the guidance by this stalls 76 and 77 over on the poster displays. I'm now going to introduce our final speaker. Sacha Langton-Gilkes is the lead champion for the Brain Tumours charity Head Smart campaign and author of Follow the Child, Planning and Having the Best End-of-Life Care for Your Child. She's lobbying government for systematic national funding and planning of paediatric palliative care in order for families to have real choices when their child faces end of life. Her oldest son died in 2012 from a brain tumour. Sacha is a singing teacher, choir director, gardener and writer. Sacha.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I love being with healthcare professionals because I can talk to you about anything, whereas I'm kind of the weirdo who talks about death at home. I have to shut up. Living with a life-limiting illness includes planning for future death. And I understand now that death is not a medical event, but a human one. Our children deserve the full arc of life, beginning, middle, and an end, and the end shouldn't be buried and hidden, but celebrated. Death is not failure. It is not the end of hope when your child dies from an incurable disease and everything has been done to give them a good quality of life up until their inevitable death. I consider that our entire medical team triumphed. I'm able to talk to other parents and also healthcare professionals about how we managed our son Didi's end-of-life care because his death was so good. It is my greatest consolation in grief and is without doubt going to be the single biggest achievement of my life. What was my son like? It's lovely to remember him with you. He loved studying science, flying birds of prey, playing with his sister, playing guitar, arguing with his younger brother, watching movies, driving me crazy, planning delicious meals and then constructively criticizing them, and talking to his friends. That's how he wanted to spend his time. His ambitions were simple: to study science of some kind at university and have a girlfriend, have a relationship. He said he had no regrets at his death and followed the teachings of Buddha, which gave a lot of comfort. I'm not Buddhist, by the way, long story. Anyway, we had a pathway to Didi's death complicated by late diagnosis of his brain tumour that led to shunt hell, i.e. multiple brain procedures over around 14 months that overlapped with the end of the PACA protocol, which he finished. He was diagnosed with a medulloblastoma October 2007, aged 11, and after the first relapse 3 years later had a miraculous reintroduction to remission thanks to etoposide. This remission led to a stem cell transplant, which was hell on earth, and led me to understand that death really might be preferable to certain treatments. Didi's final relapse was May 2012 when he was 16, and he died 3 months later with severe dementia as his wretched shunt was working perfectly and keeping him alive when I'd rather it hadn't. So I used 2 C's, calm and comfortable, at the time to describe what we needed for Didi at end of life. And we is Didi, my husband and I, and 2 siblings, Rufus and Holly, who at his end of life were 14 and 9 respectively. You know, and for things to be calm and comfortable, clearly they also need to be smooth and seamless in terms of sport. And I don't think cancer does smooth. Too many raised hopes, buried fears, and hideous waiting during operations, scans, and treatments. So there's one answer. Try and minimize any delays, and if you can't, try and say how long they'll be so we can manage our fear. Not knowing does my head in, and waiting is its accomplice. So acknowledging to parents or a young person that it's normal to struggle with waiting and not knowing helps us understand we're not being pathetic. That's what we think. And never be scared to say you don't know. An answer is better than sympathetic silence. That I found terrifying. So whilst I know we all worry about saying the wrong thing, saying nothing is worse. So here we are, I'm immediately talking about the key, the ability to have some very difficult conversations. Language matters and clarity matters. And please don't be tempted to think, because I sound educated and articulate, that means I'm able to have these conversations, but no one else can, and therefore they can be avoided. Doctors and friends have said that to me. Or say that I wanted to have the conversation, but other people don't, so they can be avoided. No one wants to, but we need to in order to support our sick children to the best of our ability. I don't want to let my child down. I would never have been able to describe myself as ready to have a conversation about Didi's death. It was a necessary evil. It had to be done. So delaying or avoiding conversations on the basis you have judged a family as not ready is not going to help with a smooth, seamless journey. I can also promise you cannot make me more upset by telling me. That's what my oncologist was worried about. I've been able to talk to him about it since. As I'm already saturated in grief, I'm on DEFCON 1. So not telling me what I need to know, either by softening language to the point where I might not understand, or avoiding the conversation, takes away my ability to have some control over the process and feel empowered. So you're the vital gatekeepers. And we don't ration information on that basis to pregnant women, not help them plan, tell them what to expect or watch out for, because they might not be ready or able to cope or understand. Together for Short Lives says that families say they want clear, straight information on end of life. And I read their book for healthcare professionals supporting a family whose child is at the end of life in preparation for writing my book. And I was like, oh, that's what they call it. Oh, that's what they were doing. You know, I'd like to have known at the time. I would have found it reassuring. Tell us, you know, name it. Don't use euphemisms. Without clear information, we can't articulate anything as parents or young people because we can't make choices because we don't know what they are because we've never done it before. And the worst examples I know of are where the family does not even realise the team knows their child's about to die, their organs are shutting down, and it's not clear until their child is dead. Or if the young person or family does realise, but the referral to the palliative team was so late, there's then too little time to offer any choices about their death or afterwards. I know of families whose children have died in the ambulance on the way home or to their hospice. What's that as a place of death? The side of the A30? I was incredibly shocked when I discovered that most children or young people, according to Public Health England's report on place of death for children with cancer, die in hospital in the UK, not in our fantastic hospices. Hospital was categorically the last place Didi wanted to be. He wouldn't have achieved any of the things he wanted to. It would have killed me. None of our community could have helped as it's over an hour away without traffic. And the fact is, it would have cost 8 times more money per day to the NHS. So what was our experience? So we did have a transition to palliative care. Palliative was the word no one dare mention all the years of his curative treatment. We had an introduction by stealth. So the palliative specialist nurse popped in to introduce herself right at the beginning when he was, M0, when our expectations were that he would be in the lucky 75% who make 5 years having finished his treatment. And I remember thinking, my child's not dying. Why is this woman going to talk to me? You know, I gave her a filthy look, I basically refused to speak to her. So that stealth approach is not going to work because we misunderstand palliative. I thought, like everyone else I've ever met and asked, it meant just end-of-life care. Someone's telling me without saying the D word for die, my child's dying now, because I didn't understand the difference between incurable and terminal end of life, and that it's often difficult to recognize the latter. You know, for someone non-clinical, I imagine that spotting death would be really very obvious. So, you know, it's like it's hard not to let that erode confidence in clinicians. I mean, I realize now that doesn't mean healthcare professionals don't know anything. It's just you can't ever say with any accuracy when my child's going to die. So you have to prepare and plan for life and death in order to best support a child and family. And it's hard to grasp just how unpredictable prognosis is. And as a parent, of course, I'm going to want to believe your best answer in terms of length of time. So it's so tempting to let unrealistic hopes creep into the unknowns. So please explain it really carefully. I also thought, like everywhere else, it meant stopping treatment. The press says it all the time. Or letting someone die by not doing anything anymore. So I am giving up on my child and relinquishing hope and therefore being a terrible parent. You know, I certainly didn't understand that deciding against a particular intervention is still an action, a positive choice for and with my child. It's not doing nothing. My aunt even confused palliative care with euthanasia, that you were helping someone to die rather than helping someone who is dying. So for me, these misunderstandings need to be tackled first at the introduction and palliative care talked out loud from the start. I didn't know until after Didi died that it literally just means to mitigate the symptoms of serious disease or disability. Well, I wish I'd known. Then I wouldn't have needed a transition to palliation. You know, it would be completely seamless and we would have reduced late access to these vital services if it will explain that my child's going to be under palliative care from the start, whether they're expected to survive or not. And crucially, if you engage early, there is data to show you'll live longer than if you don't. That, to me, is a game changer, you know. So the current level of misunderstanding means that parents will do what I did, resist the conversation, get angry, and put off accessing all the incredible care that will support not just my sick child, but the whole family. So all the mums in my book, except Teresa in the US, who had no palliative services whatsoever in the whole of Florida, I'm not kidding. And they were all like, oh my God, well, I wish we got there earlier. You know, if only we'd known this is what it could do, you know, the relief from respite. You know, these are the people who enable our child to live well longer. And when they twigged that a hospice was home from home, you know, everyone thinks hospices are just when your child's dying, so they won't make contact because they think that means that they've given up on their child. So if we're talking about smooth and seamless, get a palliative specialist or a children's community nurse into the hospital for the meeting of diagnosis of incurable disease because they know what palliative care is and can explain and link to all the care out in the community and signpost parents to it. We didn't have a palliative specialist at that meeting in hospital, only disease specialists, which I know is very common in the UK as there aren't enough of them. The epilepsy specialist nurse happened to be on shift, so she was brought in to support us, which was right in the sense that we knew her very well, so she felt like family, but Dee didn't have epilepsy. So only one of the mums in my book had her children's community nurse present at that diagnosis meeting in hospital. Everything linked up. She was the only one linked early to her hospice for respite, and she was supported to the extent she was able to go to her funeral directors a year before her son actually died, and that conversation clarified for her what was going to be right for them as a family. And she realised that place of care was going to be home, but for them it would be better to go into the local children's hospital at the end and not stay at home. And he had a death fit for a king, her words. He had one of the leukodystrophies. So, when you want to discuss end-of-life planning as part of the palliative regime, for me, tone is kind of key. And I now know your word for this is parallel planning, and it's got nothing to do with parking. So you're hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst so you can minimize crises. That's so what I was after, that result in emergency admission to hospital, and ensure all a child's wishes are fulfilled before and after death. So comfort or supportive care sounds pathetic to me as a parent, sorry. I once want to do something, and isn't all care that anyway? So sort of active, positive doing language that makes us understand that palliative end-of-life care involves lots of treatment. You're not stopping treatment. It's just not usually curative. Enhanced supportive care sounds much better, but please don't substitute that entirely for palliative, because it's like calling Voldemort in Harry Potter something else and hoping people will still not be scared. So explain that there's nothing more I can do doesn't mean I can't help you anymore. It's just that cure is now off the table, but you can still do loads for, not to, our child. So I need to understand that no cure doesn't mean no life or no hope for my child. So hope is therefore being redefined at this meeting from one of a cure to achieving and doing other things important to my child. So you're not taking hope away from us in this difficult conversation. You're helping us to see a life for our child going forward. That's what our dad said, and it was his little baby that was going to die. Based on what they love until the inevitable death. We still have hope. And knowing we did everything that our son wanted to do before he died is everything to our family. And if we don't understand our child's disease is incurable and or terminal, we're going to have unrealistic expectations, and they're much more cruel when they're dashed. But we also don't want to be the coward who stopped fighting. And I see, looking back, just how much unhelpful language we were bombarded with by our families, the public, TV, social media, and newspapers, and it often ran counter to what our medical team was saying. And it gives us in our family the idea that even thinking our child's going to die means we'll somehow be making it more likely, and that being a brave, good, fighting parent means denial, means equating being positive with endlessly thinking, my child won't die, my child won't die. It drove me crazy, people saying to me, you've got to be positive, you can't give up. You've got to feel you've tried everything, right? And I eventually sort of twigged that I've got to feel I've done everything, meant I've salved my conscience, but then I realized it's not about me, and it's not okay if on my behalf I've made my child suffer unnecessarily according to the doctors. And since the Garden Evans cases, we have even worse extreme language. Either we parents have murdered our child, or the doctors have. So you can help me counter all this stuff by warning me about the language out there and telling me straight away I can't make my child's death happen by thinking about it or stop it either. And no one's giving up on our child. It's the disease's fault, not mine as a parent or yours as healthcare professionals. So much guilt we struggle with as parents. And I now know that what made these conversations so hard was grief. Grief for the life we thought our child and family was going to have. I'd like to have known that's a thing. Parents would find that really helpful. It's something called anticipatory grief, to distinguish it from the grief that follows the death. I just thought I was going mad and being pathetic. I couldn't keep a grip. And I seriously recommend you watch the video specifically done on this by the US Parent Network, Courageous Parents Network, with an experienced psychologist talking to a bereaved parent, and let families know about their resources. You can watch them on their phone, and you can search by topic or disease. So we had to face the wall of accepting cure was no longer possible, and we were in a terminal end-of-life phase at the second relapse meeting. I already knew he was neurologically impaired, that he had dementia, but it was only me that saw the signs at that point, which meant that I took the lead, whereas before my son would always respond and take the lead in these meetings. So I took the decision we were going home with full symptoms management, and my husband agreed, because I knew from watching my mother manage my father's death 20 years before it was possible and what Dee Dee wanted. No more chemo, no more steroids. He made me promise on that. Nothing that would prolong his life in any way. You know, why would we want him to lose his mobility slower? He'd already lost that twice and clawed it back, and give more time for the pain to increase. That was the big one for me. So we basically chose maximum quality of life over length of time because that was right for our child. No more scan stress and absolutely no more hospital ever. It was party time. And our oncologist was very clear in saying the cancer was now incurable, and Dee Dee asked if he was going to die, to which we all nodded. But what he was worried about, he came out with that later that night. And he said, well, why can't Gary, who was his oncologist, why can't he just give me a pill and I can die straight away? And I said, because it's illegal, I'm afraid. But I could see it wasn't the death, because his Buddhism had helped to take away the fear of death, but it was obviously the process that frightened him. So I said, well, do you remember the last 3 times you've been really nearly dead? And he looked at me slightly shocked. Nope. I said, you won't know. They'll have all your symptoms under control like they always do, and we're just going to party till then. And that's what he needed to hear. And that was the last time he asked me. So, but we were bombed, obviously, after that meeting. Relief came with what I now know is called the advanced care planning meeting. Again, it wasn't a sort of formal thing, but I would like to have known that it's a formal thing. That it's anything with the word plan in the title when you're facing something like this is fantastic. I'd requested it be at home, but only I was present. My son didn't want to know the details. He just wanted to know he'd be comfortable. And I wish I had a video to show you how relieved I was afterwards. When I just discovered I had to sign the piece of paper and then no one could take him to hospital, and another one to stop CPR, I was so relieved and astonished, and then so was the nurse palliative specialist. And I remember her saying, it's so much easier to do this when you know what the family wants. And I realized I knew what to ask because I helped my mum with my dad. But obviously for families who don't, you need to ask, what are you worrying about? What isn't working in their child's care? How would they like to spend their time if they could? And tell them what you can do to enable that to happen. So families can't make decisions if they don't know what's liable to happen and the choices available. And I include in this choices for after the death when we were talking about organ donation. We were gutted, obviously, because his cancer treatment, we couldn't donate any of his organs. But now we would donate his brain to science because he would have loved that. So, please talk about it, because for us it is hope and legacy for our children to enable future cure. It makes their death mean something. So I basically made myself tell the nurse at that meeting everything I was worried about, so I could know what to expect, to have all the right equipment and everything in advance, and to prepare his siblings. So his sister would say things like when they were going on a walk, "Are you going to go weird now?" At which point my son would mime a seizure. They do say never work with children and animals. Wow. So of course they don't take it as you imagine they would. It is incredibly hard to hear what's to come, but I knew not facing it would mean unnecessary crises. And it was the summer holidays, and I had his 2 younger siblings. So I was very nervous of the midazolam syringe. So the nurse took me out of the packet, showed me how to work it, what to do if it didn't work. I knew who to call when. I'd always be talking to someone that knew us and our situation 24/7. There is no way that I would have had the confidence to be at home if I thought there would be breaks in our support. I needed to feel reassured, and I was. I now know I could have been further reassured about controlling pain, my biggest terror. I had got the idea in my head that some pain was uncontrollable, but I discovered that the bottom line is you can always control pain, but the cost in terms of quality of life of rendering the patient unconscious, it's a trade-off. I wish I'd known that. So the way it worked was I was instructed to call the specialist nurse at hospital without fail on a Friday first thing to say how we were doing, and before his dementia really took hold, he used to instruct me to tell the team he wasn't dead yet. And then the MDT meeting was held straight after the call, and the plan adapted, and the whole team updated if new medical things had come up. And things, really only changed in terms of nursing the last 2 to 3 weeks of our 3 months. His dementia, not a word any healthcare professional used until I did, meant he had absolutely no short-term memory by this time, which his little sister took full advantage of. And he didn't know who anyone was or what he was doing, but what seemed to keep him calm was his body knew it was at home and was on autopilot in a way until the last seizure. He'd become very disinhibited and would say some very inappropriate things, which is I think, why the palliative nurse warned me a children's hospice could not cope with a child with Dee Dee's complex medical needs. And I was shocked by that, and having now got to know our local children's hospice director, she was wrong. Even though I don't think going to a hospice would have been right for us because of his dementia, I discovered I could have had hospice care at home, which would have been perfect, and I wouldn't have got so exhausted. We were just very lucky. We had the right gold standards framework training at our GPs, and a lot of people are community supporting us. So Dee started then to wander at night, and I couldn't cope. So then Marie Curie were brought in, and we had the same couple of nurses alternating most nights. And I know they don't normally nurse children, but because as he was 16, and crucially as there was a clear plan in place, they helped. Whoops, sorry. The last seizure, about 5 days before he died, made it clear it was no longer safe for him to be up and about because his legs didn't work. And that was the only occasion in those months when he did get distressed. I knew I was out of my depth, made the call. District nurse and my GP came straight over. We were into an injectable medication because he could no longer swallow. And there was absolutely no question of inserting a feeding tube with his disease in such an advanced state. The GP entirely agreed. And once he was sedated again with those brilliant syringe drivers, it was massive relief. He was calm. And then the last worry was that we'd somehow not be in the room with him when he died, and were terrified to leave him during those sort of endless days of semi-coma. But again, experienced nurses reassured. So when the Marie Curie nurse arrived at night, we'd brief her, she'd assess him, tell my husband and I to go to bed to rest, and she'd wake us if anything happened. And in the end, the morning he died, my husband and I and Dee Dee's brother were there with the nurse with extra backup for my mum and sister. But after he died, I washed and prepared his body and dressed him with the help of our district nurse. I absolutely didn't want anyone to touch him, and I wish he'd not had to go to the undertaker's fridge. I couldn't contemplate him being shuttered, and what I now know is I could have borrowed a chiller blanket from our children's hospice to keep him at home. But the healthcare professionals around us didn't know this, and it does matter because you've only got one chance to get it right. So to finish, I was recently asked by a GP what the one thing was that enabled me to cope, and I couldn't answer straight away, but now I can, and I acknowledge it's a strange word given the subject. It's confidence. Parents like me think, I can't do this, support my child through death. It's impossible. I won't be able to cope. Everything's going to fall apart. So the teams supporting us have to give us confidence by asking directly what we're worried about and telling us what to expect, what to do, who to call when, and we're not alone. We can do it, and you will help us. The last thing, lucid thing Dee Dee said was, I love it here. So I know we all did the very best job for him, and I just wish our whole team had been there to see it. I'll say again, it was the polar opposite of failure, and I will never be able to thank them enough. And I'll end with a Ben Jonson poem that comforts me, where he's comparing an oak that lives 400 years with a lily that flowers for just one day. In small proportions, we just beauties see, and in short measures, life may perfect be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hard act to follow, I think. We've got 5 minutes if anybody has any questions. So there's a couple of people in the room with roving microphones. So does anybody have any questions for any of our speakers? Go on. I would just like to perhaps ask a question of Susan. In terms of young people with cystic fibrosis, young adults, where do you believe that a hospice role would fit in? Certainly my own experience has been quite often their community-based support rather than hospice-centred, and certainly from a children's hospice point of view, we rarely see young people with CF these days.
We can hear me. We work with hospices quite a lot. It's quite tricky for hospices to understand what we're up to when we're putting people on non-invasive ventilation, continuous intravenous antibiotics, and saying that they're at end of life. But people who want to be at home for as long as possible get a lot of help from hospices by hospice nurses going out to help them at home. They go to the hospices for some of the stuff that goes on during the day. We've had a couple now who have died in hospices, but our team have gone out to support the hospice staff quite a lot. But unusually, as I said, we have a lifelong relationship with these people. They know us extremely well, we know them, and they do request to die in hospital because they're like their second home. They bring all their stuff in, the room gets full with all the things they would normally have at home. All the family members are there. We, the staff on the ward, don't go in unless it's necessary and to support them. So it is a sort of unusual turning things on its head sort of way. But yeah, we do get help from hospices in some places.
And I think that's a key point, really, because as we talked about perhaps throughout the day, hospices are no longer about buildings and walls. They're about a concept and being part of a team. I think it's about reflecting on how we can all support each other with different aspects of care.
Can I just add, our population is very young, but they're not children, so children's hospices are not very good for them, and yet they haven't got cancer and they're not older, so they're sort of in their 20s mostly, and that's quite a difficult age, I've found, for some hospices to deal with as well.
Thank you. Anybody have any other questions?
Thank you all for an amazing session, especially at the end of a day. It kept us all on the edge of our seats. My question is for Susan as well. I'm a palliative medicine consultant in Southampton and do some proactive work with our CF team alongside one of our nurses. So first of all, a comment and then a question. We use your Cystic Fibrosis Trust ACP document, and you know it's my favourite ACP document, and the two of the things you had in red, discussions about organ donation and about transplantation, always lead to the best, deep and meaningful discussions, and it's making me rethink how we do advanced care planning with people with other problems and illnesses. My question is, so we're already using that, and we're thinking of helping and working with our Cystic Fibrosis Centre to start using it at the annual MOTs, the annual reviews. I just wonder if you see that as an opportunity for advanced care planning.
Firstly, thank you. That's our first outside comment about the ACP. It's amazing. I'm glad I came for that. We've discussed with particularly the patients who've already used it when we should start having that conversation and whether it should be the annual review. And it's a bit of some want it and some don't. So annual review now, we start talking about transplant as the way in. Even if they're really, really well, we can say you're really, really well, but you know, at some point we will start talking to you about other things like transplant. And because, as you know, we know them very well and they know us, it's just an opening for the conversation, so the next year we can go a bit further and a bit further, or it allows us, if things go shockingly wrong during the year, at least we've had an into it. And now we put it up on our electronic patient records, even if we just start the ACP and there's just one comment on it, now we've got something to build on. And it allows family members also to be part of the conversation, and some of these young people have got partners and they want their partners to be in and not their parents, and it's bringing everyone together.
Okay, thank you everybody. If there's no burning questions, I'll close the session for today. I know you're probably all keen to get ready and off for the meal this evening or off home. Just quickly to say, the presentations will be available on the Hospice UK website, and a number of the presentations are available in abstracts throughout in the building if you go outside. Thank you very much.